Hi everyone, my name's Oliver. I'm the Director of Insight and Engagement at Campus Life. And over the next 5 minutes, I'm going to share with you our findings on what your prospective students are looking for from their upcoming university experience, plus what you can do to ensure that the start to this academic year is as smooth as possible for both them and you. So if you don't know who we are, we're Campus Life, we're student communication specialists, and we help you engage with your current and prospective students through a range of bespoke digital communication services. Everything we do is driven by insight into what students want from their university experience, and we're really passionate about creating content that gets your message across through video, social media content, and on our bespoke digital platforms, Welcome and Browser. Now, what you might not know is that we regularly work with schools and colleges across the UK to understand what sixth form students expect and want from their upcoming university experience. So I'd like you to say hi to Isma and Poppy, two sixth form students in Leeds who are starting university this September. I spoke to them to get their views on what they were expecting university life to be like and what they were looking for online to get this information.
Mainly pictures of trying to imagine myself there, because obviously with COVID we haven't really been able to visit it.
Yeah, I'm the same. I've never actually been to Durham before, so I have no idea what it's like at all, so trying to understand that a bit.
So from Manchester, Durham, and St Andrews, I'm guessing you've never been to any of these places?
No.
So the main thing you need to think about is that due to lockdown restrictions, most students have never been to your campus or even your city. Now this has huge implications on what students are expecting from their university experience and really their whole concept of university in general. They're missing these massive blocks of information that help them form this picture of their future self at university. So they're not going to know things like the orientation of campus, the distances between accommodation and campus, or even parts of the accommodation themselves because they've never actually been. So what's the size of the room? Is there a common room? What's the building like? So where are they getting this information from? So do you watch a lot of YouTube?
Yeah, I use that far more than anything else.
I've actually relied on YouTube quite a lot in choosing my unis, because on the uni websites they're quite general and vague, but you can really get some inside information and really get a feel for the place and the uni when you look at student views of it.
So they're making their decisions on which university to go to and what their whole university is like by what they find on YouTube. It's the biggest influence on a sixth former's choice of university and their accommodation, and they're turning to it to get this feel of what university is like. So if it's not obvious already, it's absolutely vital that you make YouTube one of your key platforms in how you talk to your incoming students. After this, take a moment, go on YouTube, type in the name of your university, followed by accommodation, and then see what comes up, because that's what students are going to be watching and forming their opinion of what your accommodation is going to be like. Now, a lot of this information is provided for every year's intake, but this year it's more important than ever because students won't have visited your uni before, and they're actively looking for this information on YouTube, not on the university's website. So create content that's all around what's in the accommodation, particularly the communal areas, what social activities there's going to be, the distances between accommodation and campus, and some student reviews of what current students' experience is like. Think about, from a campus point of view, think about the facilities that are available, so promote your coffee shops and dining outlets, because they certainly won't have seen them. And actually, the feeling of going out to eat as a group might still feel like a novelty come September. Consider the orientation around campus, and again, the distance of how you get from campus to the city centre, and many other things like that. Now, obviously, we create a lot of this content anyway, as I'm sure you might know. So we've done walking routes showing this orientation of the campus and the city. We've done campus guides, and we do student vlogs as well. Plus, we can film remotely now too. So we can film with your staff and students without visiting your campus at all, providing a much lower cost option to get really great quality peer-to-peer content. If you'd like to know anything more about that and also how we can help you promote those videos through paid advertising campaigns on social media, then get in touch, and we'd love to share more of our findings with you and help prepare your income students for their best life at your university.
Good morning and welcome back to CUBO Winter Conference 2021, and I'm delighted for this upcoming session, Insights from HEPI into the Future of HE, that we're joined by Dr. Alexis Brown, Director of Policy and Advocacy. Alexis, thank you very much for joining us this morning. So before we enter into the detail of your session, just a bit of housekeeping from me. So you'll have seen a bit of VT from one of our principal sponsors, Campus Life, but also it would be remiss of me not to mention our other principal sponsors for this event, without whom we wouldn't be able to put these sorts of events on. So thanks go out to Co-op Franchise, Quadient, WES, Star Res, and Unite Students. Much appreciated. Your collaboration, facilitation in terms of these events is very much appreciated. So just to remind you all that these sessions are being recorded. And the recorded sessions will be circulated post the event to colleagues who are unable to attend. Just to remind everybody, in respect of our ongoing Twitter competition, to utilise the hashtag CUBO Winter 2021. That's CUBO Winter 2021, and we will be awarding a prize for the most prolific tweeter at the final session of the day later on, probably around 4:15. We're really encouraging interaction. We'd like as many questions as possible, so please utilise the live Q&A feed throughout this session and of course throughout the rest of the day. Just a gentle nudge and prod. So discussion forum is for discussion, and if you've got a question, please put it in the Q&A, because it's much easier for us to identify them that way. So and we'll do our best to get through those towards the end of the session. So we also have a chat feature we call the discussion forum, and there's opportunity through the meeting hub to talk to each other and talk to our partners outside of these sessions. So without further ado, then I'm going to ask my colleagues from WES to play Alex's insight session, and then we will come back for Q&A. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alexis Brown, and I'm Director of Policy and Advocacy for HEPI. A bit about HEPI. We're the UK's only specialist think tank focusing on higher education issues. We're nonpartisan, and we're supported by largely universities. A bit about me as well. Prior to working here, I was working for the Russell Group and also UCL, and I have a background in academia, having finished a PhD in 2017. In terms of what we're going to be doing today, I first want to talk a little bit about how COVID has affected higher education and international students as well, before moving into a deep dive into one of the most important but thorny issues facing higher education right now, student finance. So what has COVID changed in higher education? The answer may be that it's still too soon to tell. We had a chat with an accommodation manager not too long ago who said that postgraduate take-up of accommodation is still behind what it was in 2019, but it's looking more robust for next term. So there is still some chance that things will return to a kind of pre-pandemic equilibrium. Alternatively, we may find that some online component, particularly for international students, is here to stay. Perhaps more important than making predictions, however, is recognizing how difficult those predictions can be. Most of the predictions made about the pandemic have been totally wrong thus far. The IFS, one of the UK's most respected think tanks, predicted that 13 universities might collapse because of COVID-19. When I was working at the Russell Group last summer, we were sure that the sector could face a £2 billion deficit from international students not showing up in autumn, which would have crippled the UK research base. But of course, it didn't. No universities collapsed. And actually, there was a rise in international students of something around 2%. And domestic students rose as well. The same has been true of online teaching. There were predictions last year that moving to online teaching would make higher education infinitely scalable and become the norm from here on out. But of course, that again also hasn't really happened. From both students and ministers alike, there have been serious criticisms of online teaching and a call for a return to in-person teaching. Even if lectures remain online, students want that kind of teaching replaced with other kinds of face-to-face learning. The pandemic has actually reduced the amount of support for online learning, and face-to-face teaching has gone from being twice as popular to online teaching as 3 times as popular now. Even separate from the pandemic, it's important to think about how our student population is changing as well. The disruption in A-levels over the past 2 years has meant that more students than ever are coming from the UK to study at our universities. This has coincided, of course, with Brexit, which has meant there's been a serious drop-off in EU students as they're no longer eligible for home fee status this year. This does mean that our campuses are going to be less diverse in some ways, but it's not going to be a disaster for universities financially. Those EU students who are still staying are now paying international student fees, and they're also not eligible for the OFS teaching grant. So that pot of funding has become less diluted as well. This is all while recruitment for international students has remained remarkably strong, even through the pandemic. This rise has increased significantly over the last decades and continues to grow, in part because international students just are so lucrative. And on the other hand, you have inflation continually eating away at the unit of resource for domestic students. You can see how it becomes all the more tempting to plug this gap through more and more international students. And that's not even getting into the nitty-gritty of how income from international students often cross-subsidizes research as well. This is, I think, going to raise difficult questions in the future, however, if this trend continues. At what point will universities start decreasing domestic places in order to make space for international students? And what kinds of dependent relationships does this dynamic create with countries like China? You can see this already with, I think, the new National Security and Investment Act that just went through Parliament and will come into effect in January. Government is becoming increasingly wary about how dependent our universities are on foreign investment and funding. Yet at the same time, they're unwilling to stump up the cash to make themselves to plug the gap. It is truly difficult to argue with this relationship, though, when you see the economic value that international students are bringing across the country, including the regions. We recently did a study with London Economics looking at how, by constituency, this impact can be measured. And I think part of the real evidence of this economic impact is the way that you've seen the visa system change over the past year. While there is still, I think, what you could call a hostile environment for most immigrants, you, on the other hand, for students, see things like the new graduate route, post-study work visa, precisely because this country has so much to gain from a robust international student population. In general, demand is remaining strong for higher education. Even in the last 10 years, as the population of 18-year-olds was falling due to demographic shifts, the demand for higher education actually grew, which is pretty extraordinary when you consider that fees also increased threefold during that time as well. Now we're facing the opposite, and the population of 18-year-olds demographically is due to skyrocket 25% over the next decade. What can this do except grow demand for higher education even further? Which brings us on to Augur. In 2011, the RAB charge, or the amount that the Treasury isn't making back from the student loans that it gives out, was only about 30%. Now it's risen to 53% this year. In per student terms, this means that for each annual fee of £9,250, the government will actually pay for £4,900. This has not escaped government's notice, and the interim Augur response we saw in January of this year spoke of the need to keep the cost of higher education under control. Another thing that's going to complement the final response to Augur, if it ever comes, is the lifelong loans entitlement, which is going to encourage more kind of modular learning throughout graduates' lives, but that as well could make the RAB skyrocket even further. And this is not to say about the kind of strain that COVID has put on public finances. So what are the options here if we do finally get a response to Augur? I think above all, government is going to be looking for ways to keep the cost of higher education under control, and there were several different options within Augur to accomplish that. The first of these, obviously, is going to be a fee cut. Reducing the fee cap without having a significant grant top-up is going to create significant savings for government. But obviously, that's going to be bad for the resource for universities. Second thing they could do is restricting the number of students. They could allow fewer students to go to university full stop, either through minimum entry requirements, say 3 Ds at A levels, or what I think is more likely, a kind of pass of English and maths at GCSEs. But that's going to have significant access implications. And for some of those measures, particularly something like a minimum entry requirements of just passing English and math at GCSEs, that doesn't really affect enough students for it to have the kind of impact on the RAB that the government would like to see. So even if some measure like a minimum entry requirement was introduced, it would either have to be so draconian as to have really serious access implications, or so kind of weak as to not really do much to help the RAB charge, that you would probably have to combine it with multiple other measures in order to get that cost reduction that you want to see, or that government wants to see at least. Finally, we have student finance measures. There's lots that you could do here to kind of tinker with the student finance system to increase the amount that students are paying back and therefore decrease the amount that government is subsidizing. One of these is lengthening the period of repayment. Right now it's 30 years. If you were to extend it to, say, 40 years, that would significantly increase the amount that graduates are paying back. Another thing you could do is raise interest rates, particularly for higher earning graduates. This would increase the amount that they're paying back, although I think in some ways that could be seen as politically very unpopular. Another thing that you could do is lowering the threshold after which graduates begin repaying their debt. It used to be 21,000 during the coalition government. Then, Theresa May raised it to, I think, 25,000 under her government, perhaps as a kind of counter offer to Labour's offer to scrap fees entirely. So that 25,000 then became what it is now, which is over 27,000. That really has affected the RAB charge and how much graduates are repaying right now. What many are advocating for is that lowering of the threshold to either closer what it was when it was initially introduced under the coalition government, or another option here is to reduce it to the non-graduate median earnings, so that the level at which graduates begin repaying that debt is more directly related to the benefit, that the financial benefit that they're getting from having that degree. All of these are, I think, in terms of the student finance measures, potentially politically unpopular because they are going to shift more of the burden onto students. During the same time as well, that they're also facing a national insurance hike, it's going to be a significant burden. And so you can see how that would be unpopular, but none of these options, I think, are without significant downsides. You either have something that's going to be really financially stressful for universities in terms of a fee cut. You could see some institutions even falling over, which again, if some of those institutions are in former red wall seats, that's politically difficult. If you're restricting the number of students and allowing fewer students to go to university, that's going to disproportionately affect students from the most deprived areas of the country. That's politically toxic as well. And then student finance measures, as we've also seen, are going to be shifting more of that burden onto students when they're probably least likely able to repay those measures as well. And finally, another option is cutting funding for foundation years. But that as well, similar to minimum entry requirements, are going to have access implications. We recently published a report on this by David Willits, who's the former university finance minister. He was advocating, and he was very kind of instrumental in the tripling of the fees, he was arguing that the graduate threshold should be set back to 21,000, where it was during the coalition government. His point is that while most people are going to see this move as damaging to students, he sees it as protecting loans and tuition fees as crucial to maintaining higher education for students. In other words, if funding were collected for higher education via general taxation, like it would be, say, if tuition was free, that funding that is coming through general taxation could be swallowed up in other high priority budgets, such as health and social care. I hadn't thought of it in this sense before reading this paper, but it did strike me as probably true and a good point. There is something about the loan structure in itself that really designates that funding for higher education specifically and makes it impossible to kind of swallow it up into other budgets. I think I will leave it there if anyone has any questions.
Alexis, welcome back on screen, and thank you very much for the insight. It's as I said earlier, it's much appreciated. So I think you've certainly highlighted, to me anyway, the sort of the challenges of crystal ball gazing, really. So, and I don't think any of us really know ultimately what's going to happen, and even the most sensible and educated minds have been getting it wrong at various points over the course of the last sort of 12 or 18 months. So, and the whole piece around remaining uncertainty in relation to Auger report outcomes as well. So I think it was much heralded, the Auger report. So, and it feels probably rightly so, I guess, as a consequence of pandemic, that it's very much at this point in time fallen, it's fallen down the back of somebody's filing cabinet almost. So, but there's an inevitability that it's going to come back around at some point. So, if I may, I'm going to launch into a couple of questions. So, and hopefully there's some stuff here that you'll be able to respond on. You're certainly much better placed than I will be anyway. So, so I have a question from Jenny Shaw. Do you believe that the government wishes to freeze or lower the number of young people going into HE, and perhaps in favour of vocational routes?
Oh, yeah. I mean, they've pretty much said that as much in the interim Auger response, which was in January of this year. They have said in pretty explicit language at various points that they just think too many people are going into higher education, and that, too few are pursuing more vocational FE degrees. I think they've been very upfront about that. The kind of bigger question is, well, who is going into HE who shouldn't be? And how do you get them to go into FE when, there was some millennial cohort data from UCL that said 97% of parents wanted their kids to go to university regardless of background. It is still a very aspirational thing, I think, for a huge part of the population. And so how are you supposed to divert those people who otherwise would be going into higher education? Is it through cultural change? Is it through something like minimum entry requirements, student number caps? It's it's a tricky thing to do because it's not necessarily what students themselves or their parents want them to be doing. It's very tricky, but I think absolutely yes. If it were up to government, much more people would be going into FE and vocational degrees than higher education for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess also the challenge with that as a change of direction is that this government and prior governments have pushed the agenda for a number of consecutive years, saying actually universities for everybody should be going to university. So yeah, it now becomes quite difficult to deliver a slightly different message. We've been banging the drum on that for a number of consecutive years. So interesting. I've got a question actually that popped into my head as you were talking. So how can universities best support the sort of levelling up agenda, do you think, particularly in respect of R&D spending, I guess? So is there anything that we could be looking at institutionally in terms of more regional or geographical focus in terms of our R&D spending in particular?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think when you're thinking about how universities can contribute to the leveling up agenda, it's all about thinking locally, right? What are the local businesses in your areas, the local industries that you could be partnering with, whether that's through, degree apprenticeships or more kind of closely developed course material, closer relationships in terms of employment after degrees, things like that, for sure. We recently published a report by Mary Stewart and Liz Schutt, who are at the University of Lincoln, on regional R&D funding and what you can do kind of as a university to aid in that agenda. They looked at a really interesting range of case studies as well, not just at the University of Lincoln, but also in California, San Diego. And yeah, I would really recommend anyone interested in regional R&D funding to take a look at that report. And there is, I think, a regional R&D aspect to the leveling up agenda, but there's also, I think, more kind of civic university things that we can be thinking about as well in terms of how universities can contribute to leveling up. So yeah, there's a huge range of things out there.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think we have a session later today, specifically in relation to residential life. So I think we're all acutely aware in the HE sector, and particularly those of us that are on the, or have been on the sort of at the coalface, I guess, around increasing incidences and challenges in terms of student mental health and so on and so forth. And I just wonder if HEPI undertaken any research in relation to the sort of suggestions, I guess, in terms of tinkering around the student loan system and how students feel about that in terms of the potential for an extension of time and payment and so on and so forth from a mental health perspective?
Yeah, actually, very, very good question, because we just published a report today by Claire Callender, who I think is at UCL, on the kind of psychological burden of student debt, which I would highly recommend everyone take a look at as well if you're interested in this. Yeah, it's really, really interesting because there's so much kind of written about, and I feel like so much anxiety with students about how student loans have increased. But if you look at how much they're actually repaying right now, modeling from London Economics shows that it's something like 88% never repay their loan in its entirety. Something like a third of students never even begin to repay it currently. So as much as there's this enormous psychological burden around, say, 47K of debt upon graduation, the majority of students never pay that back, in part because of the 30-year repayment threshold. And the fact that, the majority of many people's debt is just going to disappear once that's over. So yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding from students in terms of how that debt actually works. The fact that it doesn't function like other student debt. And there can be a real mismatch between kind of the actuality of their debt and the way that it feels as a kind of psychological burden, which is a real shame, because actually, the way it's currently functioning, a lot of them are never going to have to pay all of that back. They're still getting SLC statements saying that, you owe this much, which, is really stressful.
Yeah.
In terms of what's on the table for Augur and how that would affect how they feel about their student loans, it's a really good question. I would love it if someone did some kind of focus group research on this, because it's unclear to me how engaged students are in the minutia of how the policy landscape with Augur, and how these slight changes could affect how much they're paying back, as opposed to the current system when Theresa May raised the graduate threshold, repayment threshold in I guess it was 2017. Did students even notice? It's really unclear. How engaged are they in these issues as they're happening on a kind of granular level in the policy landscape? I don't know. I'm not sure anyone's done that kind of work yet. It will be very interesting to see if we could get a response to Augur as soon as next week, but we've heard that before. So it's unclear, but I think it will be absolutely fascinating to see how students respond to any changes to the student finance system, and how that shows how engaged they are in how that kind of minutiae works.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Having sent my eldest son to university back in September, so I'm sure he's not in the minority, but frankly, I consider myself reasonably well educated around student finance, and despite my best efforts, he wasn't interested. Wasn't interested at all. So much to my
Yeah, it
annoyance.
can feel really far away, doesn't it? Especially when you know you're not going to have to start repaying it until you're making over, 27K, which when you're 18 is an enormous amount of money. So
yeah, absolutely. So another question from our members. So what does the argument for scrapping fees look like in the UK?
The argument for scrapping fees. I mean, it's a good question. It's kind of unclear whether that is even on the table for Labour right now, to be honest. Obviously, it was, under Corbyn. It's maybe less clear whether that's still the case. We just don't know. What does the argument look like? It's a really good question. I mean, it would be enormously popular with students. That is probably the strongest argument that you could make for it. I don't know. I've thought a lot about this and what free tuition looks like and how it actually works in this country. And I think outside of that kind of popularity for students, it's unclear how strong the arguments would necessarily be, in part because when you're looking at initially, of course, you're going to say like, oh, well, if it's free, then students from more deprived backgrounds will be more likely to apply for university, things like that. But to be honest, under the current kind of fee regime, because there haven't been any student number caps either, access has increased counterintuitively. And increased debt hasn't actually seemed to discourage students from more deprived backgrounds from going into higher education. And it's unclear whether suddenly having scrap tuition fees would increase that trend. I think part of the problem with free tuition fees is that they usually come with student number caps, which means that you only have a set number of places for students. Historically, we've seen that when there are fewer places for university, those places tend to go to students from wealthier backgrounds. You can see this in Scotland, right, where you have, free tuition, but a student number cap, and you are more likely to be from a wealthy background if you're going to university in Scotland as opposed to England.
Yeah.
So that's a tricky one, actually. Yeah. I mean, there are obviously arguments that are more philosophically based in terms of, education is a right and should be free for everyone. But on a kind of practical policy level, I think actually the arguments for are more complicated than you would immediately think.
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, somebody has to pay in some way, shape, or form.
Well, yeah, and it's like this is the thing, right? Like there is no such thing as free higher education. Somebody's paying for it. The question is who, and should it be the people who are maybe benefiting from it, or should it be everyone?
Yeah.
And are the benefits from higher education evenly spread enough across the population to justify everybody paying for it? It's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer, but that is, I guess, the kind of key question to be asking.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like a title for a future session. So we'll keep that one in the background. So I'm going to shout out again to everybody that's on the call. Just say if you have a question for Alexis, then please add it into the Q&A at this point in time. So I do have a further question. So I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned earlier. So in respect of institutions failing potentially, so politically, is it realistically, it's ever likely that current government or even future government would really allow a significant HE player to fail? Was it likely to lead, are they likely to bail out in some way, shape or form? And I appreciate that's a difficult question you can't necessarily answer, but that element of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really good question. And obviously during COVID, that was something that everyone was talking about. And there was, I think it was around this time, no, it would have been like a year and a half ago during the beginning stages of COVID that government published its restructuring scheme, which essentially offered, if you do these things, then we will help you. I don't know, because as much as obviously there's been a push towards marketization in higher education over, the past 10 years, does that actually function to the extent that they would let providers fail? I'd be surprised, in part because, ones that might be more at risk of failing could be in former red wall seats, where it really wouldn't be politically expedient for that to happen, I think. And nobody, especially, if you were representing an area, can you imagine if the university in your constituency was about to collapse? You would do everything that you could to keep that from happening.
Yeah.
And it could look really, really, really bad. And it could also kind of create higher education cold spots in particular areas that have been historically deprived as well. So I would say that it could happen. I would be surprised if it actually would. What's probably more likely is if, a provider was really on the edge of collapse, it would probably be merged with a different college or university in the area, so that it's not like the students wouldn't have anywhere to go. They would just have to kind of merge with another institution.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have another question. Is the government, again, potentially it's crystal ball gazing, I suppose, but is the government likely to intervene on type of course in the future? And this is the whole sort of value argument, particularly around outcomes, I guess.
Yeah. This has been kind of a live topic for a while now. It certainly was with Gavin Williamson as well. If any of you are following what happened with the newly renamed Strategic Priorities Grant in January of this year, basically Department for Education sent a letter to the OFS saying we are slashing funding for these low priority subjects, which included, archaeology, creative arts, media, things like that. And that was a very kind of clear indication that this was going to be subject-based, and some subjects were better than others and more important than others. And the language in the letter also implied that, this was just the beginning, that, the funding was being halved this year, it was going to be gone next year, it was just being phased out. I think you could see that a continuation in that direction. That was also under Gavin Williamson. Nadeem Zahawi might be very different in terms of how he thinks about these things. I might be too soon to tell really. Going back to free tuition fees as well, it's interesting because if tuition fees are free, that means that government has complete control over which subjects get funding. And so while all they could do was cut like the 250 grant top up that happened with the T grant in this past year, if say all of that funding was coming from government and none of it was coming from the fee, then they could really cut the funding for those courses. So to have free tuition, you have to really trust your government to fund the courses that you want to fund. I think there is such an emphasis around what is considered a kind of low value course. It's never been well defined. Graduate outcomes are one way of doing that. Last year we saw the proceed data, which combined continuation rates with proceeding on to employment, things like that. That's one way of measuring it. It would be very, very tricky to single out specific courses, and it would create a massive backlash. And if at the heart of, targeting low value courses in certain subjects is just wanting students to repay their loans, there are probably other ways that you could approach that, like the student finance measures we've discussed, that would have their own kinds of backlash, but wouldn't necessarily be restricting what students are allowed to study, because that really is tricky to pull off. And it will just create such a backlash. But maybe, you never know.
Yeah, somebody somewhere in Whitehall may have an appetite to do that. So and good luck to them. So I think, actually, we've just had another question pop in, so just bear with me. So the question is, with the cost of living rapidly on the rise, on top of existing questions about affordability, do you think we might see a reckoning about an increase to student maintenance loans? And if so, what might that look like?
Will there be a reintroduction of maintenance loans? Yeah, it's a good question. Because obviously that was included in the Augur report as well. It suggested reintroducing maintenance loans. or not loans, grants for students. So you could see, it would be, it would be very progressive to reintroduce maintenance grants for the most kind of, disadvantaged students. And we've often heard that there is a real issue with the current kind of quantum of maintenance loan not being enough to cover what students are able to pay. There's also, murky kind of expectations around what parents are expected to contribute as well. That's not always as clear as it could be. Will there be a reckoning? Yeah, I think there could be, particularly if you see at the same time things like there being, the national insurance hike at the same time as we have all of these student finance measures coming in, and cost of living continuing to rise. What I think, if government wanted to avoid that, what they could do, what I would probably do, is just cut the tuition fee a bit to say $8,500, which I think was, just before the spending review, there was an article about, maybe that was under consideration as a way to kind of appease students on that front. So if you kind of slightly lower the amount of debt they're coming out with, you're both saving money then, because you're not having to front up as much cash for their loan at the start of the degree, and then you're also just doing something really popular with students. So that could be one way of avoiding that, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Political sleight of hand, I think. Right? So to an extent. Yeah. Okay, excellent. I think we're done with questions and we're approaching the end of the session. So I wanted to just say a final thank you very much for joining us today. It's been your insight's been really interesting, and I'm sure our members have got a great deal from it. So just as a reminder to everybody that's been on the call, so the session has been recorded, so it will be circulated again after the event, as it were. So finally, Alexis, you want to say thank you very much again for your time. It's appreciated. So I hope you have an exciting rest of the day, and I look forward to seeing you again at some point in the future. And I think we've got a potential for quite a few interesting topics, and particularly if your crystal ball gazing is right and something happens with Augur next week, then we'll all be very excited. So
fingers crossed. I just can't wait anymore. Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to speak with you all.
Yeah, that's no problem. And a reminder to everyone that's on the call, so please don't disappear for the day. So we have a number of sessions ongoing across the rest of the day today. So when our next session kicks off at 11:45 and relates to sustainability on campus. So I look forward to seeing you all there. So, and at that point, we'll draw it to a close. Thanks very much, everybody. Appreciated.